Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd as we continue our study in the New Testament, introducing the genealogy and the birth of Jesus Christ today in the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 1. I do want to invite you to open your Bible and study with us. Well, having introduced the Gospels of Luke and John, I will briefly do the same as we consider the Gospel according to Matthew. Now, written by the disciple whose name it bears, Matthew was also known as Levi in the Scriptures. He was Jewish by birth, and before he became a disciple and follower of Jesus, he was a publican by trade. In other words, he was a tax collector. You can see a little bit of his coming to Christ and following him in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 9 and chapter 10. Well, like Luke's Gospel, Matthew records Jesus Christ's conception, virgin birth, life, and earthly ministry. Now, some might find the first 17 verses of Matthew's Gospel tedious and wonder about its significance. And yet I assure you, the genealogy of Jesus Christ is essential in making the case for his rightful claim to the throne of David. Well, with that introduction, look with me at Matthew chapter 1. Now here we have the genealogy of Jesus Christ, that is, his human ancestry, beginning with Abraham, Matthew chapter 1 and verse 2, through David, Matthew chapter 1 and verse 6, culminating with Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ, Matthew 1 and verse 16. Now, Matthew did not state Joseph begat Jesus, but rather he was, quote, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. Now, that distinction, that truth is absolutely essential regarding our understanding of who Christ is. Now, Luke chronicled Mary's lineage and stated Jesus was legally supposed the son of Joseph in Luke chapter 3 and verse 23. Matthew staked Christ's claim as heir to the throne of David through the lineage of Joseph, his adopted earthly father. Matthew 1 and verse 16 to 17. Now, this is also clearly stated in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, referencing enmity shall be between the serpent and the woman's seed, not the seed of man. And so the opening verses of Matthew's Gospel prove that Jesus was the legitimate heir to the throne of David through his unique lineage. Now, also very interesting in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1 and verses 1 through 18, we find 5 illustrations of God's abundant grace. Now, among the 42 generations of men named in Jesus Christ's lineage were the names of 5 women whose testimonies were arguably scandalous, if not infamous. And yet, all 5 women stood out as testimonies of God's mercy and grace, that is, his unmerited favor and kindness. Now, the first was Tamar. You find her mentioned in verse 3. Her testimony is recorded in Genesis chapter 38. Now, Tamar played a harlot and enticed Judah and ended up bearing 2 sons of him, thus establishing the royal lineage of Israel. And so we have the first one that is mentioned, playing the harlot. The second one was Rahab. She's mentioned in verse 5. And who was she? She was a prostitute of Jericho who hid Israel's spies in her home before that city was destroyed. Now you find the record of that in Joshua chapter 2 and Joshua chapter 6. There was also, thirdly, Ruth. We find her mentioned in verse 5. She's identified here as a Moabitess. Now, we read about her in Genesis chapter 19. And she was a descendant of Lot's incest with his eldest daughter. Now, Bathsheba is another that we find, the fourth one, though not named. In fact, she's identified here in verse 6 as her that had been the wife of Urias. And so what did she do? Bathsheba, she committed adultery with King David and would later bear him a son named Solomon, through whose lineage would come Jesus Christ. And then the fifth portrait of grace that is found in Matthew chapter 1 is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now she is described as a virtuous and yet a humble girl of Nazareth, verses 26 through 37. And that is, of course, Luke chapter 1. Now, the Lord chose Mary to be the virgin mother of Jesus, his only begotten Son. Now, of all the world's women, Mary was chosen to be the virgin mother of God's Son in verse 18. And Joseph was selected to be the protector and provider for Mary and her son, Jesus. Now, we know little of Joseph beyond his loving care for Mary and her son. And yet his deliberations when he found Mary bearing a child, that is with child, verse 18, before they came together, revealed him to be a just man of royal lineage, of verse 19. Joseph was also a man of faith who believed God, verses 20 through 23. And what did he do? He took Mary to be his wife. We read in verse 25, and he knew her not till she, Mary, had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. In other words, he assured and ensured that Mary truly was the virgin who would give birth to God's only begotten Son. Now, I invite you to subscribe to www.heartofashepherd.com, and there you're going to find several study questions. Now, these are important. It gives you an opportunity to go back, review what's in the Scriptures, and to grow in your understanding. In fact, my goal is through our study in the New Testament that I will have study questions at the end of almost all of the day-to-day studies. Well, I certainly appreciate you being a part of Heart of a Shepherd, and I wish you God's best. Bye-bye.